All right, welcome back, everyone. We're diving back into modern Indian history, and trust me, you UPSC aspirants out there, this stuff is gold for your GS1 prep.
Absolutely. And even if you're not prepping for exams, understanding this era is key to grasping how India evolved.
Last time, we scratched the surface, but today we're going deep, really deep into 18th century Bengal.
Think intrigue, power struggles, and a system of governance so bizarre it'll make your head spin. The dual system.
Yeah, the dual system.
Yeah.
Even I get a bit lost in this one, but that's why you're here, so you've got your sources ready.
Oh, a whole stack of them ready to shed some light on this convoluted period.
Excellent. Well, where do we even begin with something this complex?
Well, you can't really understand the dual system without going back to a key turning point. The Battle of Buxar in 1764.
Buxar. Okay, now that rings a bell, vaguely. Remind us why this battle was so pivotal.
Okay, picture this. The British East India Company, they're still relatively new on the scene, right?
Right, still finding their footing.
Exactly. And they go head-to-head with this massive combined force. The Mughal Emperor, the Nawab of Bengal, and the Nawab of Awadh. Total underdog situation.
Yeah, sounds like a recipe for disaster for the British.
You'd think so. But they pull off a stunning victory. It's a seismic shift in the balance of power in India.
Wow. So Buxar basically gives them control of Bengal.
Not outright control, no, but it definitely gives them a major upper hand. And here's where things get interesting. The British, at this point, their main goals are pretty straightforward. Profit and control. They're not quite ready to directly rule all of India.
So how do they square that circle, wanting profit and control, but not full-on governing?
Well, that's where Robert Clive, this key figure in the East India Company, comes up with a pretty ingenious, if ultimately flawed, solution, the dual system. And this is all formalized in 1765 with the Treaty of Allahabad.
Treaty of Allahabad. That name pops up a lot when you study this period. It's clearly a major turning point.
It is. This is where the British, they get really clever. They manage to secure both the Diwani and the Nizamat.
Diwani. Nizamat. Sounds like a history exam just threw up on us. Break it down for us.
Okay, fair enough. Diwani, in simple terms, is the right to collect revenue. Think of it like controlling the purse strings, the lifeblood of any government.
Gotcha. So the British got their hands on the treasury. What about this Nizamat thing?
Nizamat, that's the authority over civil administration. The police, the courts, basically all the day-to-day functions of government. And this is where the dual bit comes in. See, the British get the Diwani from the Mughal emperor.
The Mughal emperor, he's still around at this point.
Oh yeah, he's still kicking, but his power is fading fast. But he still carries a lot of symbolic weight, you know?
Right, like the old guard, not quite in charge anymore, but everyone still pays attention.
Exactly. So they get the Diwani from him, and then, here's the kicker, they get the Nizamat from the Nawab of Bengal. So it looks like local control is still in place, but the reality is...
The power is shifting big time.
You got it.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see how this dual setup works. British controlling the money, Nawab supposedly in charge of administration. But how does this actually play out in practice?
All right, so imagine this. The East India Company basically becomes the Diwan, the chief financial officer of Bengal. They call the shots on all revenue, how it's spent, everything.
Okay, so they're basically calling the shots, but the Nawab, he wasn't just a figurehead, right?
Well, not completely powerless. He got to appoint a deputy, a subadar, to handle the day-to-day stuff.
So like delegating responsibilities, CEO to COO kind of thing?
You could say that, but there's a catch, of course.
I knew there had to be a catch.
The Nawab could only appoint or remove this deputy with the company's say-so. And to really rev it in, the Nawab himself, he got a fixed allowance from the company, basically on their payroll.
So the British hold the purse strings, they control who's even in charge of the day-to-day, and they've got the Nawab on a tight leash. This dual system, it's starting to sound more like a takeover.
It's a system that, on paper, might have seemed like a clever balancing act. But trust me, the reality on the ground was a lot messier, and that's what we'll explore next time, the consequences of this whole arrangement.
I'm already on the edge of my seat. We've set the stage, got this seemingly balanced system in place, but something tells me those cracks are about to start showing. We'll be back to dig into those consequences. Don't miss it.
All right, welcome back. Let's jump right back into this whole mess that was the dual system in Bengal. It might have looked okay on paper, but in reality...
Yeah, our sources make it clear. Things went south pretty quickly. A whole lot of unintended consequences and chaos under that thin veneer of order.
What's really fascinating is how the system's flaws, they weren't necessarily intentional, at least not entirely.
Okay, so explain that. How can something so messed up not be deliberate?
Well, the British, remember their main focus? Profit, maximizing their gains. But that laser focus on short-term profits, it had this ripple effect across all of Bengal's economy.
So like tunnel vision, they were so obsessed with making money, they didn't see the bigger picture.
Exactly. Bengal, at this time, it was still largely agrarian, right? Its wealth, it came from the land, the crops.
Right. Classic agricultural society.
But the British, they were so fixated on immediate profit, they neglected the very foundation of that prosperity, agriculture.
So they're taking all this wealth out of Bengal, but not putting anything back in.
You got it. There was very little effort put into improving farming practices, investing in irrigation, supporting the farmers who were the backbone of the Bengali economy.
Well, that's just short-sighted. It's like cutting the branch you're sitting on.
Exactly. And the consequences were devastating. You mentioned the Bengal famine of 1770, right?
Millions of lives lost.
Yeah.
It's a horrifying reminder of what happens when you prioritize profit over people.
And the famine, it was a direct result of this neglect. It was like a perfect storm. You've got the company laser focused on revenue, neglecting the agricultural infrastructure, and then on top of that, a bad harvest hits.
It's almost as if they were asking for it, you know?
In a way, they were. And the famine, that wasn't the only consequence. The dual system also really stifled local trade and commerce.
So not just agriculture taking a hit, but the entire economy.
Yeah. Along with this whole revenue extraction focus, you had this rampant corruption among company servants.
So they're bleeding the economy dry and lining their own pockets at the same time?
It was basically a free-for-all. These servants, they were engaging in all this private trade, often using their influence to undercut Bengali merchants and just squeeze even more profit out of the system.
It's like a double whammy for the people of Bengal.
Yeah.
Agriculture's in shambles, and now they can't even trade freely.
Exactly. So economically, the dual system was a disaster. But it wasn't just the economic side that was messed up.
Right. Our sources talk about the administrative side of things being pretty chaotic, too.
Oh, it was. The dual system, it created this bizarre situation where the British, they had the power, they had the money, but they lacked any real incentive to govern effectively.
So they were basically absentee landlords, just interested in collecting the rent.
Pretty much. Power without accountability. And on the other side of that equation, you've got the Nawab, stripped of his resources, stripped of his authority, unable to maintain law and order.
So it's a lose-lose situation. The British are too busy counting their profits to govern, and the Nawab's hands are tied.
Exactly. And what happens? Lawlessness runs rampant, crime rates soar, and it's the ordinary people of Bengal who are caught in the middle of all this.
Yeah, this is where you see the human cost of this grand experiment. It's easy to get lost in these big abstract ideas, but this was about real people's lives being impacted by this dysfunctional system.
It really highlights the fact that these weren't just abstract concepts, Diwani and Nizamat. It was real people, real lives being impacted by this system.
Okay, so we've seen how this dual system, meant to bring order, brought chaos instead. But what I find really interesting is what happened next. Did the British just keep stumbling along with this broken system, or did they learn anything from this disaster?
You know, for all its failures, the dual system was a wake-up call for the British. It forced them to face a hard truth, their obsession with profit. It just wasn't compatible with effective governance.
So they had to admit they messed up.
Well, maybe not admit it outright, but they definitely started realizing that they couldn't just keep extracting wealth and ignoring the consequences. The dual system's failure really exposed the limitations of indirect rule, this idea of controlling India through alliances and puppet rulers.
So if indirect rule was a bust, what was the alternative? Direct rule.
That's exactly where things were headed. The British started realizing that if they wanted real control, they couldn't rely on these shaky alliances. They needed a more direct, assertive approach. And this realization, well, it set the stage for a whole series of reforms, gradually dismantling what was left of the dual system.
So they moved toward the more centralized, hands-on approach.
Yes, paving the way for what we know as the British Raj. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? This messy, exploitative dual system, it was all about quick profits, but in the end...
It backfired spectacularly.
And it ended up transforming the very nature of British involvement in India.
A classic case of unintended consequences. History's full of them. And for our listeners out there, especially those gearing up for the UPSC exams, this is a key takeaway.
Absolutely. You can't just memorize dates and names. You've got to understand the why, the motivations, the ripple effects, how one event sets the stage for the next.
It's about seeing the connections, the big picture.
Exactly. The dual system, it wasn't just some random blip on a radar. It was a turning point. It shaped the whole trajectory of British Indian history.
All right, so let's do a quick recap of what we've covered today. We started with this seemingly balanced dual system, right? British control the revenue, local rulers handle the administration. On paper, it sounds almost elegant.
But elegant on paper doesn't always translate to reality.
And the reality was anything but elegant. The British, obsessed with profit, they neglected agriculture, leading to economic hardship and that horrific famine of 1770. And then you've got rampant corruption making things even worse.
And on the administrative side, it's a total mess. The British are too busy counting their money to govern effectively, the Nawab's powerless to do anything, and Bengal's just spiraling into chaos.
Leading the British to realize they need a whole new approach.
And that shift from indirect to direct rule, well, that's a whole other story for another time. But the dual system, even though it was short-lived, it left a lasting mark on India.
It's a period worth understanding. It helps us connect the dots, see how the past shapes the present. So, to all our history buffs out there, and especially our dedicated UPSC aspirants, here's something to think about. How did this shift from indirect to direct rule shape British colonialism in India? What were the long-term consequences? It's something to explore, to ponder, because history, it's more than just dusty old textbooks.
It's a story that's still unfolding, and understanding the past, it helps us navigate the present and maybe even shape the future.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the dual system. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with anyone who's curious about this fascinating period in Indian history. Until next time, keep those minds engaged and keep exploring.